In 1997, Boeing didn't just merge with McDonnell Douglas. It walked straight into an ambush. For decades, Boeing had ruled the skies with engineering brilliance, turning metal and fuel into legends like the 747 and 777.
A major shakeup this morning at Boeing.
There are serious allegations being made today against Boeing by one of its own engineers.
But in the middle of that aviation arms race, another giant made its move. McDonnell Douglas didn't beat Boeing in the market. It infiltrated it. And almost overnight, the world's most trusted aircraft builder began shifting its focus away from innovation and toward quarterly earnings, shareholder pressure, and quiet compromise. Before the merger, Boeing was leading the industry, pushing boundaries with long-range performance, advanced materials, and fly-by-wire integration. After the merger, headquarters moved from Seattle to Chicago. Engineering was sidelined, outsourcing exploded, and those decisions would echo through the development of the 747-8, the 787 Dreamliner, and ultimately, the 737 MAX. 2 decades later, the price of that cultural takeover became impossible to ignore. Catastrophic crashes, quality failures, and a name once synonymous with safety, now stained with doubt. So how did one merger hijack the DNA of America's greatest airplane maker? Let's go back to where it started.
Good morning. I'm Phil Condit. In a few minutes, Harry Stonecipher and I will hold a news conference to announce publicly that we are now operating as a single company.
By the early 1990s, Boeing was the undisputed king of commercial aviation. It had a proven record with groundbreaking aircraft like the 707, the 747 Jumbo, and the long-range 777. Engineers held significant authority within the company, and big bets on new designs were not just encouraged, but they were also expected. This was a company that prided itself on solving tough problems with even tougher airplanes. Meanwhile, across the country, McDonnell Douglas was struggling. Once a leading rival with aircraft like the DC-8 and DC-10, the company had slowly lost its edge. Production delays, safety concerns, and a string of high-profile failures, including the DC-10 cargo door incident in the 70s, had left a mark. But the issue wasn't just technical. The cultural difference between Boeing and McDonnell Douglas couldn't have been more stark. At Boeing, based in Seattle, the culture was rooted deeply in engineering. Aircraft were designed by the book and then some. Teams would iterate on designs for years before releasing a new model. The 777, for instance, had the most extensive computer-aided design process in commercial aviation history at the time. McDonnell Douglas, headquartered in St. Louis, leaned more heavily into defense and government contracts by the 80s and early 90s. The margins were tighter, the priorities were different. Instead of radical innovation, the focus was on making incremental upgrades that were cheaper, faster, and more risk-averse. So when the merger was announced in 1997, it looked like Boeing was simply absorbing a struggling competitor. But behind the scenes, that's not exactly how it played out. McDonnell Douglas may have been the smaller company, but many of its executives landed in key positions post-merger. Most notably, Harry Stonecipher, McDonnell Douglas's former CEO, became Boeing's president and COO, and later CEO. It was a subtle shift, but a significant one. Boeing didn't just gain McDonnell Douglas's aircraft, it inherited its executive mindset. You could see the shift in product strategy almost immediately. Instead of continuing Boeing's tradition of ground-up innovation, there was a pivot toward cost efficiency and shareholder value. Projects like the Boeing Sonic Cruiser were scrapped, and updates to existing aircraft like the 737 Next Generation and later the 737 MAX took center stage. On the surface, it looked like smart business. The 737 was already a bestseller. Why not stretch it, tweak the engines, and get more value out of an existing platform? But this philosophy clashed with Boeing's traditional engineering-first culture. Even geographically, the company began to change. In 2001, Boeing moved its corporate headquarters from Seattle to Chicago. To some, it was just a business decision to be closer to Wall Street, centralize leadership, and better coordinate global strategy. But to many engineers on the ground, it felt symbolic. The distance wasn't just physical, but it was philosophical. The HQ had left the shop floor behind. The shift in culture meant fewer engineering-led decisions and more cost control strategies. There was less appetite for revolutionary aircraft like the 777 and more emphasis on tweaking what already worked. Risky innovation took a backseat to quarterly performance. If you've ever flown on a Boeing jet, you've felt the product of that culture shift. Stick around because in the next chapter, we'll explore exactly how that change impacted Boeing's most important programs. After the McDonnell Douglas merger, Boeing was still the dominant name in commercial aviation. On paper, it remained the same company. But as the years passed, the cracks started to show not in the logo or the livery, but in the product decisions, the engineering process, and eventually in the aircraft themselves. One of the first signs of change came with the 737 Next Generation series. Instead of designing a clean sheet replacement for the aging 737 Classic, Boeing opted to stretch the platform. Sure, there were some updates, better engines, a glass cockpit, new winglets, but underneath it was still a 1960s airframe, designed for a different era of aviation. That decision made short-term financial sense. Airlines already owned fleets of 737s. Pilots were trained. Maintenance crews were ready. The NG series sold like crazy. But Boeing had quietly made a bet that evolutionary upgrades were safer financially than revolutionary leaps. That bet caught up with them 2 decades later. By the mid-2010s, Airbus had launched the A320neo, an efficient, modern narrow-body with new LEAP engines. Boeing scrambled to respond. The result was the 737 MAX, a heavily reworked version of the next gen, with larger engines bolted underneath wings that weren't originally designed to carry them. And that's where the now infamous MCAS system came in. The larger engines shifted the center of gravity, creating a tendency for the nose to pitch up in certain flight profiles. Instead of redesigning the airframe or retraining pilots, Boeing added software to counteract the pitch. On the surface, MCAS seemed like a smart workaround. But here's the problem. Many pilots didn't even know the system existed. The MAX was marketed as just another 737, a seamless transition for airlines with no costly simulator time required. Internally, some engineers raised concerns. There were safety reports, disagreements, pressure. But by then, Boeing's culture had shifted far enough that executive decisions carried more weight than the people designing the planes. Then came the crashes. Lion Air Flight 610, followed by Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302. Both aircraft entered uncontrollable dives shortly after takeoff. Both were MAX jets. And both pointed back to MCAS, which had been activated based on faulty sensor input, overriding the pilots and pushing the nose down repeatedly. That's when the industry and the public started asking hard questions, not just about MCAS, but about what Boeing had become. This wasn't the same Boeing that built the 777. This wasn't the company that had spent a decade perfecting the 747. This was a company where program deadlines and stock prices were beginning to overshadow engineering instincts. And the 737 MAX wasn't the only symptom. The 787 Dreamliner, launched in the early 2000s, was supposed to be Boeing's next big leap. Lightweight carbon fiber fuselage, modern cabin pressure systems, fuel efficiency. On paper, it was revolutionary. But it came with a new kind of risk: outsourced manufacturing. Instead of building everything in-house, Boeing spread the 787's production across a global supply chain. Fuselage sections from Italy, batteries from Japan, electronics from France, and final assembly in South Carolina. In theory, this cuts costs, but in practice, it created chaos. Delays piled up. Coordination problems emerged. Some parts didn't fit properly. Subcontractors weren't always on the same page. In the end, Boeing had to buy out some of its own suppliers just to keep the 787 on track. At the same time, morale inside the company was shifting. Engineers who once had the final say were increasingly sidelined by executives and financial analysts. There were still brilliant people inside Boeing. The talent hadn't disappeared, but the voice of engineering had grown quiet. Boeing's internal priorities also shifted. The company began spending more on stock buybacks than on R&D. From 2013 to 2019, Boeing repurchased over $43 billion worth of its own shares. That's money that could have gone into building the next 757 replacement or refining new aircraft concepts. Instead, Boeing stuck with legacy platforms and short-term gains. Even military projects, which had long been Boeing's backbone, started to suffer. The KC-46 Pegasus tanker program ran into repeated delays and hardware issues. The 777X, a stretched and re-engined version of the 777, also hit snags, with its folding wingtips and new GE 9X engines facing both regulatory and production setbacks. All of this led to a growing perception in the industry. Boeing had become McDonnell Douglas in everything but name. It wasn't just about missed deadlines or failed software. It was a shift in DNA from a company built by engineers to one driven by quarterly earnings. And here's where we close the loop. In the next chapter, we'll look at what happens now. Can Boeing come back, or has the legacy of McDonnell Douglas become too deeply embedded to reverse? So, where does that leave Boeing today? It's still one of the most recognizable names in aviation, still one of the two giants in the commercial aircraft world, alongside Airbus. But reputation? That's taken a serious hit. The 737 MAX crisis did more than ground a fleet, it shattered trust. Regulators were caught off guard, pilots were angry, airlines were stuck with planes they couldn't fly, and passengers, many of them never looked at a Boeing jet the same way again. This wasn't about one bad software system. It was about decision-making. It was about culture. And that's where the McDonnell Douglas story circles back. When Boeing merged with McDonnell Douglas in 1997, it looked like Boeing was in charge. They were the bigger company, the more successful one. But over time, the leadership philosophies, especially those shaped by Harry Stonecipher, former CEO of McDonnell Douglas, started shaping Boeing itself. Stonecipher famously said, "When people say I changed the culture of Boeing, that was the intent, so that it's run like a business rather than a great engineering firm." And that's exactly what happened. Now, maybe some of that was inevitable. The pressures of globalization, competition from Airbus, and the rise of shareholder-first business models changed a lot of industries in the late 1990s and early 2000s. But Boeing used to be different. This was a company that once spent $5 billion of its own money developing the 777 just to build the best plane possible, not to hit a stock target, not to outpace Airbus for one quarter, just to engineer something excellent. After the merger, that kind of thinking started to fade. The headquarters move from Seattle to Chicago in 2001 wasn't just about real estate. It was symbolic. The company's leadership was now physically and philosophically further away from its engineers. And this is where the broader conversation kicks in. Because Boeing's story isn't just about airplanes, it's about how companies lose their way, how culture shapes product, and how in industries where safety is life or death, small shifts in values can lead to catastrophic outcomes. There's a reason why so many aviation insiders, pilots, engineers, and former Boeing staff talk about the McDonnell Douglas merger not as a partnership, but as a slow-motion takeover. It wasn't overnight. It didn't happen on one executive's watch. But year after year, priority after priority, Boeing started looking a lot more like the company it absorbed. Less bold, less focused on new aircraft, less trust in its engineers. Now, to be fair, Boeing is trying to course correct. After the MAX disaster, the company reshuffled leadership. It's under tighter regulatory scrutiny. Engineers are speaking up more. There are internal pushes to restore a safety-first mindset. But the road back? It's long. Airlines still rely on Boeing aircraft. Passengers still fly them every day. But the question is, what kind of Boeing will build the next generation of aircraft? A Boeing that listens to its engineers? Does that take risks again? That leads the industry, not just in market share, but in innovation. Or a Boeing that keeps playing it safe, building stretched versions of older designs, hoping passengers don't notice the difference. That's what makes this story so important. Because the decisions that shaped Boeing's decline many of them made behind boardroom doors, have now played out across decades, across aircraft, across lives. And this brings us to today. Boeing is still a powerhouse. It's still delivering aircraft, still locked in fierce competition with Airbus. But it's no longer the company that built the 707, or the 747, or even the early 777. It isn't a question of whether Boeing can survive. You can count on it. It is up to it whether it can return to what made it great in the first place, putting engineering first with design that stands out and safety without compromise. That's what built Boeing's legacy, and that's what will rebuild its future. What do you think? Can Boeing ever go back to its engineering roots? Or has the McDonnell Douglas philosophy become permanent? In the end, this wasn't just a merger. It was a turning point in aviation history, one that reshaped how aircraft are built, how companies are run, and how priorities get set. What happened at Boeing is a lesson that still echoes across boardrooms, engineering floors, and every jetliner cruising at 35,000 feet. And maybe that's the biggest question left. If Boeing wants to reclaim its legacy, what kind of company does it have to become next? Thanks for sticking around for this full deep dive. If you found this insightful, do us a favor. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. We read every single one, and your take helps shape future stories.